There's a certain quality that happens with a blade as it's being heat treated. When you quench the blade to harden it, something happens in the room and it gets quiet and everything stops. And that is when bladesmiths believe that the knife gets its soul. The first sword I made was when I was 11 years old. And it was just ground out of a cheap piece of mild steel. The steel should be heated up to what's called a forging temperature. In industry, for a spring steel of this nature, a 5160 spring steel, that would be around 1800 to 2000 degrees. But a bladesmith will forge at a more controlled lower temperature to prevent what's called grain growth in the steel, which would make the steel weak as a blade. The art of making blades starts, as far as historians know, at least in the 3rd millennia BC. Bladesmith is really only standing on the shoulders of geniuses and masters of our past. The person with the best sword in ancient times was the one generally came out on top, and if he died, that sword got passed on. So realistically, in ancient times, sword fights probably lasted anywhere from a second to, on the outside, at most 15 minutes between two people, at most. And by the end of that, they are smoked, they're tired, they're wasted, their body and mind is drained of everything. And I'm sure there was plenty of times in history people would be carrying swords, and there was probably not too many sort of Old West shootouts over the whole thing. Whenever two people carried a sword and somebody drew, then there wasn't a whole lot of playing. There probably wasn't a whole lot of goofing around about it. It was a serious moment. This is called a jin. It's Chinese. The ancient jin swords in China were primarily used, and archaeologically we're pretty convinced that they came out of northern China. However, the northern Europeans had some blades that were nearly identical to this style. Size, shape, weight, balance, everything. And this is called a dao. This is one style of a Chinese dao. This is what the younger daos evolved into. This is a heavy chopping blade and excellent for taking off limbs, cutting a body in half, taking a head off with little effort. And these swords were supposedly endowed with special godlike powers, and whoever wielded them would inherit those powers and abilities. Much the same as the European idea of Excalibur. And every ancient culture that had any metallurgical virtue has a legend very similar to that. The blacksmith in ancient times was a very important figure. Blacksmith meaning he worked with black metals, which were irons. And this person would be important, revered on a religious level. It was a necessary part of people's livelihood for thousands of years. It's something that you cannot ignore, and I think that this will continue to gain interest and gain momentum and spur interest in martial arts that are involved in training people with swords and traditional methods and practices, and of course we may never go back and see a time where people rely on them the way they used to, you know, back in 1306 or what have you, but they'll appreciate it, they'll respect it, and they'll need to continue to recognize that history, because it's imperative that we don't let that die. And some people will just say, well, I just like swords. And some people will be like me and go on and on and on about how everything about it is interesting to them. So hot, you couldn't hardly handle it. And it'll get out here in the summer, it'll get to be 140 degrees with this running.